There's a very common illusion about human beings, an illusion most of us grow up with. We're taught that people behave based on things like logic, morality, principles, and truth. We're taught that if you're right, if you behave kindly, if you're honest, then things will make sense. People will see it, and they will respond fairly. But if you observe people long enough, something starts to confuse you. You see arguments where no one is actually listening. You see people defending positions that are obviously wrong. You see people talk about morality, but behave completely differently when their interests are threatened. At first, you think it's an individual problem. Maybe this person is uninformed. Maybe that person is too emotional. But then you begin to realize something more uncomfortable. This pattern appears everywhere. In families, at work, among friends, in politics, on social media, and that's when a question begins to appear in your mind. If everyone says they care about the truth, why do so few people actually search for it? The answer is that, in many social situations, truth is not the main objective. What matters more is your image in front of others. Imagine a simple situation. Two people are arguing. On the surface, they're talking about a topic, politics, work ideas, some kind of decision. But if you watch carefully, you'll notice something strange. Neither person is actually listening. They're just waiting for their turn to speak. They're not trying to understand. They're trying to win. Not win logically, but win in front of the people watching. In front of friends, in front of coworkers, in front of everyone around them. Because in the human brain there is a very ancient fear, the fear of losing status within the group. Tens of thousands of years ago, social status determined something very simple: whether you were protected, whether you were respected, whether you had access to resources. If your status collapsed, your life collapsed with it. Our brains still carry that system. So when someone challenges your opinion in front of others, your brain doesn't just interpret it as a discussion. It interprets it as a status threat. And immediately, you start defending yourself. You speak faster. You become more rigid. You become less willing to concede. Not because you don't understand the logic, but because deep in your subconscious, losing in front of others means losing self. This is why so many arguments become strange. People don't find solutions. People don't change their views. They just dig deeper into their egos. And when you see this for the first time, you might feel disappointed. You might think, why are humans so irrational? But what's happening isn't actually irrational. It's simply a different priority system. In many social situations, the brain does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes status. Most arguments are not about truth. They are about status. Once you understand this, a lot of behavior suddenly starts to make sense. Why people refuse to admit they're wrong. Why people resort to personal attacks. Why people defend ideas they may not even deeply believe in. Not because they're stupid, not because they're bad people, but because they're protecting something invisible, but very important: their position in the eyes of others. And once you start seeing this, a small shift happens in the way you observe people. You start listening less to what they say and paying more attention to the motivation behind their words. You start asking yourself, are they trying to find the truth, or are they trying to protect their position? And that is the first moment of awareness. The moment you begin to understand that, human behavior is rarely just about logic. It's psychology, it's social, and very often, it's status dynamics. And once you start seeing this first layer, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. A pattern that explains why so much human behavior revolves around a single thing: status. After you start seeing the first illusion, something else begins to emerge. A pattern you may have sensed before, but never named. Most groups of people have an invisible system. No one talks about it. No one writes down its rules, but everyone feels it. It's the status system in any group. Friends, companies, families, classrooms even. Online communities. The human brain is constantly answering a silent question. Where do I stand in this group? Who has influence? Who gets listened to? Who has the authority to lead? Who gets ignored? Who becomes the center of attention? We rarely admit it, but the human brain is extremely sensitive to status signals. Within just a few seconds in a room, the brain begins reading tiny signals. Who speaks the most? Who others look at while speaking? Who interrupts others without pushback? Who laughs first? Who laughs along? These are the micro signals of hierarchy. And from there, a lot of seemingly meaningless behavior begins to make sense. For example, someone is telling a story in a group. People are listening. Suddenly another person jumps in and tells a bigger story. Bigger, funnier, more impressive. If you only look at the surface, it might seem like a normal interruption. But if you understand the dynamics behind it, you'll see that it's a status move. In many social groups, attention is a form of currency. Attention equals influence, and influence is status. In social groups, attention is a form of power. This is also why some people constantly try to talk more, be funnier, tell more impressive stories, prove they know more. Not because the information itself is important, but because the brain understands something simple. If you attract the group's attention, your status rises. Here's another example. You share a personal success, a new project, a good opportunity, a step forward in your career. Some people will genuinely be happy for you, but sometimes there will be a different reaction. Someone might say, "Yeah, that's pretty normal though." Or, "But that industry is easy." Or, "You just had good timing." It's not really because of you. If you don't understand this pattern, you might think it's just a careless comment. But if you look deeper, you'll see a familiar mechanism. When your success changes the relative status inside the group, some people feel unstable, not because they hate you, but because their position in the hierarchy feels threatened. The brain reacts in the simplest way. It reduces the value of that success. If your success isn't impressive anymore, their status isn't threatened. Sometimes people don't attack you. They attack the meaning of your success. And once you begin to see this, many behaviors in society become easier to understand. Why in meetings? Some people always try to speak first. Why in debates? Some people always want the final word. Why in friend groups? There is always someone trying to be the most interesting person. This isn't random. This is social positioning, a status game that most people participate in, even when they don't realize it. And interestingly, the more you understand this, the less shocked you become by human behavior. You stop thinking, "Why would they do that?" You start thinking, "How does this help them protect or raise their status?" And once your question changes, the way you read situations changes too. You begin to see the motivations behind behavior, not just the behavior itself. But this pattern goes even deeper, a layer that very few people recognize until they experience it directly. A psychological mechanism that makes people defend their image even more strongly than they search for the truth. And to understand that, you have to look at a defense system that almost everyone has. A system called reputation defense. At this point, you may start to notice a pattern. People react very strongly when their status feels threatened. But there's a deeper layer to this, a psychological mechanism that makes people behave in ways that, if you don't understand it, can seem completely irrational. That mechanism is reputation defense. In social psychology, reputation is not just about image. It's a form of social capital. Your reputation determines whether others trust you, whether they respect you, whether they're willing to cooperate with you. In human social environments, reputation is almost like currency. And when something that important is threatened, the brain activates a defense mode, not very different from when the body senses danger. There's only one difference. The threat isn't physical, it's social. Familiar situation. Someone is called out for a mistake during a meeting or in front of a group of friends. If their goal were simply the truth, the easiest response would be, "You're right." But that rarely happens. Instead, you usually see reactions like denial, long explanations, blaming the circumstances, or even attacking the person who pointed out the mistake. If you only look at the surface, you might think that person is overly sensitive or arrogant. But if you understand the mechanism behind it, you see something else. To their brain, it's not just a mistake. It's a crack in the image they project to the group. And that image is what they are trying to protect. Ego isn't just pride. It's reputation survival. This is why some people react extremely strongly to criticism. Not because the criticism itself is huge, but because it happens in front of others. The exact same feedback, if delivered privately, many people can accept it. But if it's said in front of a group, the brain interprets it differently. It's no longer feedback. It's loss of face. And when that happens, the brain reacts. It tries to minimize the damage, protect the image, or redirect attention. This is why so many debates shift from ideas to people. At first, people are discussing the issue. But once reputation is threatened, the conversation becomes, "Who are you to say that?" Or, "You've made mistakes too." Or, "You don't understand the situation." Those statements aren't attempts to find the truth. They're attempts to relieve pressure on the speaker's reputation. When reputation is threatened, truth becomes secondary. And once you start noticing this mechanism, you begin to understand something very important. A lot of human behavior isn't logical. It's social defense. This explains many things. Why some people never admit they're wrong. Why some people always have to be right. Why some people attack others instead of facing the issue. Not because they don't know, but because admitting they're wrong in front of others, to their brain, feels like losing status. But the most interesting part of this insight isn't understanding others. The hardest part is when you begin to see it in yourself. You remember moments when you became defensive too quickly. You explained too much. You felt uncomfortable being corrected in front of others. And you realize something slightly uncomfortable. You're playing the same reputation game too. Not because you're a bad person. Not because you're weak. But because this is an ancient mechanism of the social brain. Recognizing this doesn't make you cynical. It makes you calmer. Because when you understand where a behavior comes from, it no longer surprises you. You start seeing social situations differently. Not just asking, what's correct, but also, whose reputation is being threatened here? And that question opens a completely new layer of understanding human behavior. But there's another pattern that's even harder to notice. A pattern that doesn't happen during arguments. It doesn't happen when things are going badly. It happens when things are going well. When you start growing, when you start changing, when you start rising. And that's when another form of social dynamic appears. A form of competition that most people never talk about. There's a truth that many people take a long time to realize. A truth that makes you rethink many relationships in your life. The truth is this: in many social groups, there's a silent competition. No one says it out loud. No one admits it, but it's always there. You can live for years without noticing it, until something changes. You start becoming more successful. You change. You grow. You become more confident. You gain new opportunities. And suddenly, some people start reacting differently. Not everyone, but some. They become colder. They start joking about your success. They downplay your achievements. Or they simply stop supporting you the way they used to. The first time people experience this, it can be confusing. You think, aren't they supposed to be happy for me? We're friends. But this is where a social pattern begins to reveal itself. In many groups, everyone occupies a relative position. No one says it out loud, but everyone can feel it. Who is the most successful? Who is the most confident? Who has the most influence? Who others look up to? When you start growing, those positions change, and when positions change, the psychological structure of the group changes too. For some people, That's not a problem, but for others, the brain senses something very familiar: loss of status. It's not that they hate you. It's not that they want to hurt you. But your growth unintentionally makes them feel uncertain about their own position, and the brain reacts, not by saying it directly, but through small behaviors, subtle signals, comments that sound harmless. For example, you share a major step forward in your career. Their reaction, it's not that big of a deal. Or, you probably just got lucky. Or, that industry is hot right now. These comments are rarely direct attacks. They're subtle value reductions, a way to rebalance status in their mind. When your status rises, some people don't attack you. They quietly shrink the meaning of your success. This is why many people experience something strange. When they struggle, everyone around them is supportive. But when they begin to succeed, some people become distant, not because success is bad, but because success changes the status order in the group. Your growth doesn't just change your life. It changes your position in other people's minds. This also explains something else: why many people feel comfortable with you when you remain at the same level, the same income, the same ambitions, the same stage of development. But when you change, some relationships start becoming tense, not because you're wrong, not because they're bad people, but because the old equilibrium has been broken. In many social groups, there's an invisible balance. Everyone becomes used to their position. When one person moves upward, others have to adjust their perception, and not everyone is comfortable making that adjustment. This is one reason many people unconsciously keep themselves small. They don't want to make others uncomfortable. They don't want to disrupt the balance. They don't want to lose the group's acceptance. But once you understand this pattern, you realize something important. Other people's reactions are not always a judgment of you. Sometimes they're simply reacting to a shift in status. Sometimes people aren't reacting to who you are. They're reacting to where you are now. And once you understand this, you stop personalizing many situations. You no longer immediately think, they must hate me. Instead, you start to see, maybe they're just adjusting their position within the new picture. But this insight also comes with a cost. Because once you start seeing these hidden dynamics, you begin to notice them everywhere: at work, among friends, in families, on social media. And that realization can feel a little cold. But this is where many people misunderstand things. Seeing these patterns doesn't mean society is fake. It simply means you're beginning to see the real mechanisms behind human behavior. And as you go deeper into that awareness, an important question appears. What happens when you're no longer naive? But you also don't want to become someone who is cynical about everything when you begin to see these patterns in human behavior. One thing almost certainly happens. Your social world changes, not because the world changes, but because the way you see it changes. Before, you listened to what people said. You believed their surface intentions. You assumed that if someone said they supported you, they truly supported you. But when you begin to understand status dynamics, reputation, defense, and the quiet competition that exists within social groups, you start to notice things you previously missed. You see the forced smiles, the half-hearted compliments, the jokes with a subtle edge, the silences that mean more than words. You begin to realize that many social situations are not as simple as you once thought. And at this point, many people go through a dangerous phase, a phase of cynicism. They start seeing too many patterns. They begin to think everyone is fake. Every relationship is a competition. No one is truly good. But this is where many people misunderstand the insight. Seeing the mechanisms of human behavior doesn't mean humans are bad. It simply means humans are human. We are social creatures, and in every social system, there will always be status, reputation, comparison, and competition. Not because we are cruel, but because our brains were built to survive in groups. Understanding human nature doesn't make the world darker. It makes your vision clearer. The difference lies in how you respond to that awareness. Some people become cynical. They withdraw from relationships. They begin to see everyone as competitors. But the more mature ones respond differently. They understand that these dynamics will always exist, but they don't allow them to make them bitter. Instead, they learn how to navigate them. They understand when to speak, when to stay silent, when to debate, when to step out of the game. They understand that not every argument is worth entering. Not every form of recognition is worth chasing. Not every competition is worth winning. Wisdom is not seeing the game. It's knowing when not to play. But the deepest part of this insight is not about understanding others. It's about beginning to see yourself in those same patterns. You remember the times when you felt uncomfortable when someone surpassed you, defended an opinion just to avoid losing, reacted strongly when your image was challenged, and you realize something important. You are not outside this game. You are part of it too. The moment you see these patterns in yourself, that's when awareness truly begins. Recognizing this does not make you weaker. It makes you less reactive, because when you see the forces behind your reactions, you begin to gain distance from them. You start to watch those emotions arrive and pass. You no longer get pulled into every status battle. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to prove yourself in every situation. And this is when a different kind of strength appears. Not the strength of defeating others, but the strength of not being controlled by the invisible game. And when you reach this point, something interesting happens. You begin to respond to the world in a completely different way. Less tense, less defensive, but also clearer and sharper. And that's when awareness truly begins to turn into calm. There is a very important moment in this journey of awareness, a moment many people try to avoid, because it's a little uncomfortable. When you start understanding human patterns, status games, reputation, defense, social positioning. At first you see them in other people. You notice the person who always needs to be right, the person constantly trying to prove they are intelligent, the person who becomes irritated when others succeed, the person who protects their ego at any second. And it's very easy to think, at least I'm not like that. But if you observe long enough, and honestly enough, something else begins to appear. You have similar reactions too. There are moments when you feel uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because your image is being challenged. There are moments when you argue, not because you want to understand, but because you don't want to lose. There are moments when you feel uneasy, not because someone did something wrong, but because their status in the group just changed. This is where many people stop. They don't want to see that part of themselves. But the people who truly mature do the opposite. They look directly at it, without judgment, without denial, simply recognizing it. Self-awareness begins the moment you stop assuming you're the exception. Because the truth is, no one stands completely outside these social dynamics. They are deeply wired into our brains. They are the product of thousands of years of living in tribes, where status determined whether you were heard, whether you were respected, whether you were protected. So the brain constantly tracks one question: where do I stand in the group? This happens so quickly that you don't even notice it. You walk into a room. Within seconds, your brain is already reading signals. Who is the most confident? Who is receiving the most attention? Who is leading the conversation? Who is at the center? This is not a conscious calculation. It's the brain's hierarchy detection system. Your brain tracks status automatically, even when you think you don't care. Realizing this can feel a bit uncomfortable, but it also brings a very special kind of freedom. Because when you begin to see those dynamics within yourself, you gain distance from them. You start to notice when your ego is reacting. You notice when you want to win rather than understand. You notice when you're protecting your image instead of searching for truth. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can continue reacting the way you always have, or you can pause. A few seconds of silence, one deep breath, a small gap between stimulus and response, and that gap is where real power begins. Not the power of controlling others, but the power of not being controlled by your own social reflexes. The real power is not winning the status game. It's not being controlled by it. And when this begins to happen, you notice a strange shift. Situations that once triggered strong reactions no longer affect you the same way. You no longer feel the need to prove you're right. You no longer need to win every argument. You no longer feel threatened by every differing opinion, not because you've become weaker, but because you're less entangled in the game. And when you reach this point, the way you see the world begins to change in a very interesting way. You still see the patterns, but instead of making you bitter, they begin to bring something else, calm. There's a very strange shift that happens when you truly understand these patterns. At first, when you start noticing them, you might feel a little disappointed. You begin to see the hidden motivations behind human behavior. You see ego. You see competition. You notice status games playing out in situations that once seemed completely normal. And for a while, things can feel a little cold. But if you go a bit further with this awareness, something else starts to happen. You become calmer, because when you understand the motivations behind behavior, you're no longer surprised by it. Before, a criticism might have made you react instantly. You'd feel the need to respond, the need to defend yourself, the need to prove something. But when you start seeing the pattern, you begin to understand what's actually happening. Maybe the person is protecting their reputation. Maybe they feel their status is being threatened. Maybe they're simply reacting from ego. And when you see that, something interesting happens. You no longer feel the need to react right away. You can simply observe. When you see the pattern, you stop taking everything personally. A lot of social situations start to make much more sense. A heated argument, a sarcastic comment, a quiet competition happening beneath the surface. Before, you might have thought, they're against me. But now you understand. Many times people are simply protecting their place in the social world. This doesn't make the behavior right, but it makes it understandable. And when something becomes understandable, it loses a lot of its emotional power. Understanding removes a lot of unnecessary anger. You also begin to choose your battles more carefully. Not every argument is worth winning. Not every form of recognition is worth chasing. Not every status game is worth playing. Some games are designed to keep you trapped in them. Psychologically mature people understand this. They don't try to win every social. They simply refuse to get pulled into all of them. The strongest position in many status games is quiet detachment. And interestingly, when you stop trying to prove yourself in every situation, people begin to see you differently. Not because you speak more, but because you react less. Not because you try to appear powerful, but because you no longer feel the need to prove your power. There's a very specific kind of presence in people like this. They're not the loudest person in the room, but they're often the most stable one. They don't get pulled into every drama. They're not easily provoked by every challenge. They don't feel the need to win every argument. And that stability creates a very different kind of influence. True social power often looks like calm restraint. But the most important thing isn't how others see you. The most important thing is how you see the world. When you understand these patterns, you no longer have to live in naivety. But you also don't have to become cynical about everything. You simply see the motivations behind human behavior and choose your response consciously. And when you walk into a room after understanding this, the social world looks a little different. Not because people have changed, but because you've started to see what you once missed. And once you see that pattern, you can't go back to the old way of seeing things.